The rain came before the light did. It arrived sometime around 4 in the morning, tapping first against the tin roof of the back porch, then thickening into the kind of steady, heavy pour that fills every mountain hollow and turns the red clay at the end of the drive into something soft and untrustworthy. Eleanor Mae Carter heard it the way she always heard rain, not with alarm, but with a kind of old bone recognition, the way you recognize the voice of someone you haven't spoken to in a long while, but have never actually forgotten. She was already awake. She had been awake since 3. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, not drinking it yet, just holding it. The kitchen smelled the way it always smelled in the early morning. Coffee grounds, the faint trace of the biscuits she'd baked the evening before, and underneath both of those things, the particular damp coolness that came off the Blue Ridge in autumn, working its way through the old window frames, no matter how carefully you weather-stripped them. Outside, the maples along the road had already turned. She could not see them in the dark, but she knew they were there, orange and yellow, and the deep blood red that she had always loved best, dripping now in the rain. She had not slept well in 3 weeks. She told herself it was the weather, the change of season. Her hip, which had been stiff since August. She had a list of reasonable explanations she kept ready, and she cycled through them at 3 in the morning, when the real explanation sat in the front room like something heavy left on a chair. The boxes had appeared 9 days ago. Her son Daniel had brought them on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying them in from his truck with the careful, slightly exaggerated effort of a man doing his mother a favor, stacking them in the front room, in the hallway, along the wall, beside the coat closet. He had printed labels for them on his computer: kitchen, linens, books, clothing, and he'd stuck them to the sides with brown tape before she could say a word about it. Melissa had come too, and had moved through the house in that quiet, efficient way she had, touching things and assessing them, asking Eleanor twice whether she really needed to keep certain objects, whether some things might be donated, whether Eleanor had considered that where she was going, space would be limited. Where she was going. Eleanor had stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room, watching her daughter-in-law fold a quilt that had belonged to Eleanor's mother, and she had not said a word. She had learned across 8 decades of living that there are moments when speaking is a form of waste, when the words you have available are not equal to the thing happening in front of you. She had saved her words. She was saving them still. The coffee had gone warm instead of hot by the time she finally drank some of it. Rain moved down the kitchen window in long, uneven lines. She looked at the wall where the photographs had hung, 4 of them, framed, arranged in a shape that had never been formally planned but had accumulated naturally over 40 years. One of those photographs had been her wedding portrait. One had been a picture of her husband, James, standing on the mill property in the summer of 1978, squinting into the sun with his shirt sleeves rolled up and one hand resting on the old wooden sluice gate. One had been her 2 sons together, the elder one long gone now, and Daniel at maybe 9 years old, both of them in church clothes, looking sideways at something out of frame and laughing. The wall was bare. Melissa had taken the photographs down 4 days ago, saying they needed to be wrapped carefully so they wouldn't break in transit. Eleanor had not asked which transit exactly. She had understood well enough. She pushed her chair back and stood up slowly. The hip required that, a moment of gathering before movement, and she crossed to the counter and poured the rest of her coffee down the drain and rinsed the mug and set it in the drying rack. Outside, headlights appeared on the road. She watched them come closer, slow, turn into the drive. The vehicle that had come for her was a white cargo van, not Daniel's truck. He had arranged it through someone at his company. She didn't know the driver. She was still in her housecoat. She went to her room, moving carefully in the dark because she hadn't turned the lights on. And she dressed herself. A blouse, her good gray slacks, a cardigan, the heavy one, the dark blue wool that James had given her one Christmas. She couldn't remember which year now. She buttoned each button from the bottom up. Then she reached into the small dish on her dresser, and she picked up the key. It was brass, and it was old. The shank had gone dark with handling over the years, but the bow, the round part you held, still had that quality of old metal that is neither warm nor cold, but simply present, solid, undeniable. It was the size of a pocket watch. She had carried it for longer than she could precisely remember, which meant she had carried it for more than 50 years, because she had a precise memory for most things. She slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan and pressed her palm flat against it once, through the wool. Then she went to the front room to wait. Daniel arrived at 7:30 after the driver. He came in without knocking, which he had begun doing in the last several months. Not dramatically, not even consciously, perhaps, but steadily, the way authority expands when no one names what is happening. And he had a folder of papers under one arm and a paper bag in the other hand that turned out to contain a still warm biscuit wrapped in wax paper and a small container of apple butter. He set the bag on the kitchen counter without explanation, as though it were a toll he was paying. "Morning, Mama," he said. "Morning," Eleanor said. She was sitting at the table again, cardigan buttoned, hands in her lap. The kitchen was mostly packed. The window over the sink was clear, though, and the rain was still coming down. And, for a moment, Daniel stood looking at his mother, and the window, and the rain, and didn't say anything. He was 54 years old. He had his father's forehead, and his grandmother Ruth's mouth, and Eleanor had always been able to read his face the way you read a landscape you grew up in, not perfectly, not without error, but with a familiarity that could not be taken away. She read it now. She saw the careful neutrality he was holding there, the effort it took. She saw the slight tension in his jaw. She did not see the eyes she wanted to see, which were the eyes of a man who would look directly at his mother and say the thing that was actually true. He set the folder on the table. "These are just the last few documents," he said. "Routine things. The transfer of account management, the power of attorney update." He opened the folder and pushed it slightly toward her. "I've already handled most of it. This is just making everything clean for the record." Eleanor looked at the folder. She looked at the papers inside it. She had looked at papers like these before, 3 times in the last 4 months, each time with Daniel explaining that this was routine, that this was simply being organized, that this was what responsible families did when someone got older and needed support with the complicated parts of living. The first time he had explained it, she had asked a number of questions, and he had answered all of them in a way that was technically responsive without being informative. The second time, she had signed where he pointed. The third time, she had asked to take the papers to her own attorney, and he had said, of course, absolutely, there was no rush. And then 3 days later, he had come back with a slightly different version of the same document and a gentler kind of pressure, and she had signed that one too. She was a practical woman. She had understood at the time that something was wrong. She had not understood at the time the full shape of how wrong it was. She understood it better now. That one there, Daniel said, pointing to the second page, is just a confirmation of the property transfer we discussed. The house going into the LLC for estate purposes. Tax simplification. Eleanor said, "We discussed it." "Yes, ma'am. And the LLC is associated with your company. It's a holding structure. It's common. It protects the asset." Eleanor's thumb moved in the pocket of her cardigan. She did not take the key out. She just held it there, that small, cold weight, and she looked at her son, really looked at him, and she asked the question she already knew the answer to. "Daniel, are there debts against that company?" The silence that followed was not long. Maybe 4 seconds. But 4 seconds is a long time when you are watching someone decide whether to tell the truth. "There are operational costs," he said, "like any business." Eleanor nodded once. She looked down at the folder, and she closed it. Not dramatically, just with 2 fingers and a small controlled motion, and she pushed it back toward him. "I'll need my coat," she said, "and I'll need you to drive me somewhere before we go to wherever it is you've arranged for me to go." Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Mama, I want to see the mill," she said. "Before anything else, I want to go out to the property and see it." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she could not quite name. Not guilt, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that might eventually become guilt if he ever gave it enough room. Then he nodded. "The facility doesn't have your room ready until 2 o'clock, he said. "We've got time." He said it as though he were granting her something, as though he were the one with the right to grant it. Eleanor stood up from the table, slowly. She picked up the small wax paper bag with the biscuit in it, and she tucked it into her coat pocket, beside the key. Then she walked out of her kitchen for what she already knew might be the last time, and she did not look back at the bare walls or the stacked boxes or the place where her husband's chair had stood until last week. She had spent 81 years learning not to mistake a thing's absence for its disappearance. Daniel had always underestimated the drive out to the mill. He counted it as 15 minutes, because that was roughly how long it took to clear the edge of town, but the actual distance was closer to 40 minutes on the kind of roads those mountains produced, narrow, paved in patches, the asphalt lifting at the edges where tree roots had been working beneath it for 20 or 30 years, the shoulders dropping away into drainage ditches that filled fast in rain. The county had resurfaced the main road twice in Eleanor's memory, but the branch roads off it stayed the way they were, more or less, because the people who lived down them were the kind of people who accepted that as one of the costs of living in a hollow. Eleanor watched the road the way she always had, not anxiously, but attentively. She watched the Pruitt farm come up on the left, the old white house set back from the road behind a row of walnut trees that had been there since before either of the Pruitt brothers was born. She watched the abandoned dairy operation come up on the right, the barns still standing, but the fences all leaning now, the gates rusted open at angles, the concrete pad where the milking parlor had been stained green with decades of moss. She watched the small church on the bend, white clapboard with a gravel lot, the sign out front offering a Bible verse she couldn't quite read through the rain on the window. She had driven this road more times than she could count. She had driven it as a girl in her father's truck, pressed between her parents in the cab with the heater running and the radio not working, watching the same farms go by. She had driven it as a young woman when she was courting and then married, James always offering to drive and Eleanor usually taking the wheel anyway because she knew the road better. She had driven it the morning after her father, Samuel, died, following the county ambulance through a fog so thick she could barely see the taillights. She had driven it less and less after that, and she had driven it almost not at all in the last decade, until the mill had become one of those things she kept at a careful distance, not because she had forgotten it, but because some places hold too much of the past in concentrated form, and there are only so many days when you have the strength to go there. She had the strength today. She'd been saving it up. "The road's gonna be soft," Daniel said, slowing at the turn onto the track that led down toward the mill property. "I don't know how far I can get." "Far enough," Eleanor said. The track was not paved. It had been gravel once, decades ago, and the ghost of the gravel was still there if you looked, bits of gray stone worked into the red clay. But mostly it had returned to itself. The trees on either side had grown in until their branches met overhead, forming a kind of tunnel. In summer, it would be green and close and almost beautiful. In October, rain, it was dark and dripping, and the leaves came down in slow, wet clusters whenever the wind moved, orange and brown against the mud. Daniel's truck, he had switched to his truck after sending the van, moved slowly, carefully. He didn't want to get stuck. Eleanor did not think about whether they would get stuck. She looked at the trees. She was watching for the big sycamore. It stood where it had always stood, just before the track opened into the small clearing beside the creek, and it was enormous, 3 feet across at the trunk, its bark peeling in plates to reveal the cream-colored wood beneath, the way sycamores did, shedding their skin as they grew. Her father had told her once that sycamores were never truly still, that even in the dead of winter there was something alive and moving in a sycamore that you couldn't see but could feel if you put your hand on the bark. She had believed him then. She believed him still. The sycamore appeared through the rain, and Daniel stopped the truck. "This is as far as I'm comfortable going," he said. Eleanor was already opening the door. Mama. She was already out. The ground was soft under her shoes, red clay and wet leaves, and she moved carefully, keeping her weight even, testing each step, before she committed to it. The rain was lighter now, down to a thin mist, and the air smelled of creek water and hickory leaves, and something underneath both of those things that was older and specific and hers. The smell of stone that had been wet for a century, of wood that had absorbed decades of corn and wheat dust, of the particular mineral quality of the water that came off this section of the mountain and nowhere else. She heard the creek before she saw it. The rain had swollen it, and it was running fast and loud over the stones, and the sound of it came up through the soles of her shoes and into her bones in a way that was not quite vibration and not quite feeling, but something between the two. Then she came around the screen of mountain laurel, overgrown now, 8 feet tall and spreading, not pruned since before her father got sick. And she saw the mill. It was still standing. That was the first thing. After all the years and the storms and the ice and the neglect, the main structure was still standing, and she had not entirely believed that it would be until she saw it with her own eyes. The walls were fieldstone, the same gray-brown stone the mountains threw up everywhere, fitted by hands she had known, and some she had only known about. And stone like that endured in ways that wood did not. The roof was another matter. The eastern end had gone, a section maybe 12 feet long where the rafters had finally given way. She couldn't tell when, and the boards had come down in a pile that was now mostly composted back into the earth. The rest of the roof held, its old wooden shingles black with moisture and furred at the edges with green moss, but holding. The millstone housing was visible through what had been the main door. The door itself was gone, the hinges rusted to stumps on the frame, and the opening gaped like a dark mouth. Inside, she could see the suggestion of the great horizontal shaft, the pit wheel, the iron fittings, all of it shadow and silence, and the particular stillness of machinery that has not moved in a very long time. The sluice gate was closed. The wooden channel that carried water from the creek to the overshot wheel was still there, running along the north side of the building. But clogged, she could see from 20 feet away that something had blocked it. Leaves, probably, and debris from the collapsed roof section, and maybe animal work. The wheel itself was on the far side of the building, out of her line of sight. But she already knew from the sound of things that it was not turning. Water moved, though. She could hear it, even over the rain. The creek was up, and the old channel was stone-lined below the wooden trough, and water was finding its way through the gaps in the debris by instinct, the way water always did, the way it always had, moving downhill through whatever the world gave it, and never stopping for very long. Daniel had come up behind her. She could hear him on the leaves. "It's worse than I remembered," he said. There was something in his voice she didn't examine too closely. Not grief, exactly. Something more like relief, as though the ruin confirmed something he had wanted confirmed. "The stones will be fine," Eleanor said. "Stone doesn't rot. The floor's got to be dangerous, probably in places. Mama, you can't go in there." She was already walking toward the door. She had learned the mill the way she had learned her own face, gradually, by daily exposure, until she knew it without thinking about it. She knew which boards ran east to west on the upper level. She knew which corner of the floor had always been soft because the drainage below it was imperfect. She knew the sound the pit wheel made when the iron teeth on its outer edge were evenly loaded, and the sound it made when one tooth was coming loose. She knew where the millstones held heat long after grinding stopped, and she knew where the drafts came in winter, and she knew which of the old wooden pulleys had been replaced by her grandfather and which were original to the building. She stepped through the door and paused, letting her eyes adjust. The smell was strong in here, stone and wet grain and old iron, and a sharper note of something decayed, probably a nest of some kind in the collapsed section. The light came in through the broken roof and through the gaping door and through two small windows whose glass was long gone. And it was thin gray mountain morning light, not enough to see clearly, but enough to orient. She stood still, and she listened. Her grandmother Ruth had taught her that first, before she taught Eleanor anything about grain or gears or water. Ruth had taught her to stand at the mill door on a working morning and simply listen. "Tell me what you hear," she would say, and Eleanor would list things: the wheel, the water, the creak of the main shaft, and Ruth would nod and say, "Now tell me what sounds wrong," because something always sounded slightly wrong, always, and the miller's job was to hear it before it became something worse. The tendency of inexperienced people, Ruth said, was to push harder when something went wrong, tighten the stones, speed the wheel, force the work. But machinery tells you what it needs, Ruth had said, if you're willing to slow down and listen before you start forcing. A good miller, she said, treats trouble the way you treat a knot in a rope. Pulling harder only cinches it tighter. You have to find the loose end first. Eleanor listened now. She heard the creak. She heard rain on the remaining roof. She heard the creak of something wooden settling under its own weight, somewhere above her. She heard a small animal, a mouse, probably, in the collapsed section to her right. And then, under all of that, she heard something else. She had not expected to hear it. She had not come here expecting to hear anything except the silence of a dead building. But it was there, just at the edge of perception, a low and rhythmic sound that was not quite mechanical and not quite water, but had something of both in it, a movement below her, below the floor. She stood very still. The sound moved. It pulsed almost. It was consistent with water passing through a narrow stone channel, the kind of sound that the old interior drainage system would make if the channel were still clear and the water were still finding its way through. She looked at the floor. The boards were in poor condition, warped and dark with moisture, several of them visibly lifted at the edges. In the far corner, near where the millstone housing stood, there was a section of flooring she remembered. She had not thought about it consciously in years, decades probably, but the memory came back now with the particular ease of things learned young and never actually forgotten. That section had been laid differently from the rest. Her father had relaid it himself in the early 1970s, choosing boards of a particular thickness and jointing them in a way he had not explained at the time. She had watched him do it and not asked questions because she had been in her late 20s and worried about other things. She walked toward it, carefully, testing each board, keeping her weight distributed, moving the way she had moved across uncertain ground her whole life, not with fear, but with attention. The floor held under her. She reached the corner near the millstone housing, and she crouched down. The hip protested, a deep, dull ache, but she had long since learned to move with that, and she pressed her palm flat against the boards, the way you press a hand against a wall, to feel for a draft. The sound was stronger here. She could feel it faintly, a vibration that was not mechanical wear, but fluid movement, water passing through the stone below. She closed her eyes. She thought about her father, Samuel, building something in 1972 and never quite explaining it to her. She thought about how he had grown quieter in his last years, more careful with what he said, sealing things up in the way that old men sometimes did when they had something they didn't know how to hand over directly. She thought about the trust documents he had mentioned once or twice in the years before he died, and which she had never been able to locate afterward, and which she had eventually assumed had been lost in the general untidiness of his final illness. She thought, he didn't lose them. Daniel appeared in the doorway behind her. "Mama, the floor." "I know about the floor," she said. She stood back up, using the millstone housing for balance. She turned and looked at her son across the length of the old mill. He was standing in the light from the door, and she could see his face more clearly now, and what she saw was a man who wanted her to be finished here, who had thought this would take 15 minutes, who had thought she would walk in, look around, feel sad, and accept that things were over. He had always been a man who miscounted what he thought he owned. "I need to make a phone call," Eleanor said, "and I need you to wait." Her phone was a simple one. Daniel had upgraded it for her 18 months ago, switching her to a plan he managed, explaining that this would be easier for her, that the new phone had larger text and a simpler interface. She had noticed afterward that the billing information and account details were linked to his email address rather than hers. She had noted this, the way she noted everything, in the careful internal ledger she had kept all her life, and she had not said anything about it, and she had continued to use the phone. She stepped outside, under the overhang of the old stone wall, where the rain couldn't reach, and she dialed a number she had memorized 6 months ago. Hannah Brooks answered on the third ring. "Mrs. Carter?" "Hannah," Eleanor said. "Are you in Floyd today?" There was a brief pause. Hannah was 27 years old, a quiet and serious young woman who had driven out to the mill property 14 months earlier with a notebook and a list of careful questions about water rights and historic grain operations for a paper she was writing in her civil engineering program at Virginia Tech. Eleanor had talked to her for 4 hours that day, standing in the fields above the creek, and Hannah had listened the way almost nobody listened anymore, not waiting for a pause in which to insert her own thoughts, but actually following, building on what came before. Eleanor had liked her immediately. She had given Hannah her phone number and told her to call if she had more questions. And Hannah had called 6 more times, and they had met twice more, and Eleanor had begun to think of Hannah as something she did not have a precise word for, not a granddaughter, not a student, not a friend exactly, but a person whose presence felt right in a particular way that she had stopped expecting to feel at her age. "I'm in Floyd," Hannah said. "I drove down this morning. I was actually going to—" She stopped. "Mrs. Carter, are you okay?" "I'm at the mill," Eleanor said. "The old Carter property on the Little River branch. Can you get here?" "Right now?" "Yes." Another pause, shorter. "I know where it is," Hannah said. "I drove past it twice when I was mapping the watershed. Give me 40 minutes. "Take 30 if you can," Eleanor said. "And bring your camera. The good one." She hung up and put the phone in her pocket beside the key and the biscuit wrapped in wax paper, which she had not yet eaten and was not going to eat until she was good and ready. And she turned and walked back into the mill to wait for her son to stop pretending he was patient. Daniel was standing in the center of the mill floor, with his arms crossed and his eyes moving over the structure around him with the particular gaze of a construction man, assessing a project he would not take on. He was cataloging damage. He was calculating demolition. She knew that look. "There's a section of the floor near the millstones," Eleanor said, as though they were in the middle of a conversation. "The boards my father relayed in '72. You see them. They're a slightly different color than the ones around them. He used oak from a different source." Daniel looked at the floor. She watched him look. "What about them?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just telling you what I know about this building." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face. "Mama," he said, in a voice that wanted to be gentle and managed about 60% of it. "I know this place means a lot to you. I know Granddad built most of it, and Grammy Ruth spent half her life here. I understand that. But it's been empty for 31 years, Eleanor said. A long time. And it's not safe. And whatever's here, whatever's left, it's not going to help you." He paused. "The room at the facility is actually very nice. Melissa went and looked at it herself. There's a garden. You'd have your own bathroom." Eleanor said, "Your grandmother used to say that the worst thing an inexperienced miller could do when the grinding went uneven was to force the stones together to compensate." She said it quietly, watching his face. "She said the stones didn't need to be closer together. They needed you to slow down and find what had shifted. Forcing them together just destroyed the grain and broke the equipment, both." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I remember her saying something like that." "She was talking about the mill," Eleanor said. "But she wasn't only talking about the mill. She left that there between them and walked to the far corner and lowered herself carefully to one knee and pressed her ear, just briefly, to the boards her father had laid 50 years ago. The water was still moving below. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever known an older person whose knowledge, skill, or quiet wisdom was overlooked by the people around them? Leave their name in the comments. Some stories deserve to be spoken out loud. Hannah Brooks arrived in 34 minutes. She drove a battered blue pickup truck that had seen better decades and wore a red canvas jacket with a pen stuck behind one ear and her dark hair pulled back in a knot that looked like it had been done quickly. In the cab, on the way there, she walked down the track the way young people walked in mud, without hesitation, accepting that her boots were going to be dirty, and she had a camera bag over one shoulder and a rolled set of tubes under her arm that turned out to contain survey maps she'd been working with on her watershed project. She stopped when she saw Eleanor standing in the doorway of the mill, and her expression did something that Eleanor appreciated. It didn't manage itself. It was simply concerned. "What happened?" Hannah said. Not what happened to the mill. She already knew something had happened to Eleanor. "I need your eyes and your engineering brain," Eleanor said. "And I need you to not treat what I'm about to show you as something fragile." "Okay. I'm not fragile either." Hannah looked at her. "I know that," she said, and it did not sound like reassurance. It sounded like fact. Daniel had been standing off to the side with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching this exchange with an expression Eleanor couldn't fully interpret. She introduced them briefly. "My son Daniel. This is Hannah Brooks. She's a civil and environmental engineer." And Daniel shook Hannah's hand with the slightly over-firm grip he used when he was unsure of a situation, and then Eleanor went back inside, and the other two followed. She took them to the section of relayed floor. "The water channel below this building," Eleanor said to Hannah, "runs from the intake point up at the bend in the creek, under the wheel housing, and then through a stone culvert that exits into the lower field. That's the original design. My grandfather laid the stone channel himself, sometime in the 1920s. I saw it on the survey maps," Hannah said. "The channel's still there, or most of it. I thought the culvert had silted up." "Some of it has," Eleanor said, "but I can hear water moving below this floor." She put one foot on the boards, lightly. "My father relayed this section in 1972. He used heavier material than the original. He added a locking mechanism. I saw him work on it, but I never asked him what it was for." Hannah crouched and looked at the boards. She ran her fingers along the joints. She had good hands for her work, square and precise, with calluses on the outer edges from field work. "These boards are heavier gauge than the rest," she said. "See where they're jointed? That's not standard tongue and groove. That's a shiplap with a stop cut. It's designed to be lifted, not pried." "Yes," Eleanor said. "So there's something beneath." "Yes," Daniel said from the doorway. "The crawl space would be wet. This close to the creek, it's not a crawl space," Eleanor said. She was looking at the boards, remembering. She was back in 1972, 27 years old, watching her father work in the early morning before the summer heat came, carrying boards from his truck to the mill in careful trips, one board at a time. The way he carried everything, as though each thing deserved individual attention. She remembered him kneeling exactly where she was standing. She remembered the sound of a mallet, even, careful. She remembered that he had sent her on an errand that day. He had asked her to drive to town for something, coffee, she thought, or hardware. And she had gone because her father did not ask for things unnecessarily. And when she had come back, the floor was finished, and he was cleaning his tools, and he had not mentioned it again. He had needed her gone for part of it. "There's a release point," Eleanor said. She was thinking aloud now, which was unusual for her. He would have built in a release point, otherwise the seal would be permanent. She looked at the millstone housing, the great circular frame of the upper stone, still in place, the iron spindle running through it, the rind fitting at the top. Then She looked at the iron fittings on the main shaft. Then she looked at the floor. Then she walked to the wall, to the old wooden shelf her father had built at shoulder height, where the lubrication cans had stood and the small tools he used for fine adjustment, and she ran her hand along the underside of the shelf. Her fingers found a notch in the wood, a square notch cut into the underside of the shelf board, smooth with age. She pressed it. Nothing. She pressed and held it, and then she pressed a specific spot on the stone wall beside the shelf, a stone slightly out of true with the others, protruding perhaps a quarter inch, and she felt something shift. A sound came from beneath the floor, not loud, a quiet, heavy click. All three of them looked at the relayed section. One of the boards had risen fractionally at one end, pushed up from below by whatever had released. A quarter inch, maybe a half inch, enough to get a grip. Eleanor looked at Hannah. "The heavy boards," Eleanor said. "You'll need to lift them." It took Hannah 20 minutes to work the boards free without damaging them, because she was careful, and because Eleanor told her to be careful, told her that whatever was below had been waiting 30 or 40 years and could wait another 20 minutes. Daniel stood back and watched. He had stopped arguing about anything. He was watching his mother in a way Eleanor recognized from when he was small, a particular quality of attention he had when the world was not doing what he had expected, and he was recalculating. The boards came free in sequence, each one fitting into the adjacent ones, so that the whole section lifted as a connected unit. Hannah working one side, then the other, then clearing the last two boards individually because they had swollen in the joints over the years. When the last one came away, they all looked down. There were stone steps, 6 of them, cut directly into the bedrock, descending into a space below the level of the creek bed. The air that came up from them was cool and still and dry in a way that seemed impossible given the moisture everywhere above, but Eleanor understood it as soon as she saw the stones. Her father had sealed the chamber against water with the same care he gave to everything, lining the walls with a close-fitted fieldstone and finishing the joints with a lime mortar that had apparently held. A small electric light hung from a wire on the ceiling of the chamber below. It was not lit, but it was there. Hannah took out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The chamber below was approximately 12 feet by 16 feet. The walls were fitted stone. The floor was tamped earth over a layer of flat creek stone. And along the far wall, covered with a heavy canvas tarpaulin that had stiffened with age but held together, there was something large and mechanical, fitted with copper fittings and iron couplings, and connected by a pipe to what appeared to be the original water channel in the mill's old drainage system. Eleanor could not see it clearly from the top of the steps, but she recognized the shape of it. She had seen drawings. She had watched her father study books and order parts by mail, and spend weekends down in the lower level of the mill when she was a teenager, experimenting with something he said was going to change how the mill operated, something he said was going to let them keep the lights on, even after the commercial customers stopped coming. She had forgotten that project, in the way you forget things that never quite finished materializing. But it had not failed to materialize. It had simply been finished in secret and sealed and left to wait. "Hannah," Eleanor said. "Can you go down?" "Can you?" Hannah said, not as a challenge, but as a genuine logistical question. Eleanor thought about the 6 stone steps and the hip and the 81 years. "Help me," she said. Hannah went down first and turned back and offered her hands, and Eleanor descended 1 step at a time, holding Hannah's forearms, and at the bottom she stood on the flat stone floor, and she looked around the chamber in the light of Hannah's phone. There were shelves on one wall, fitted into the stone with iron brackets, and on those shelves were containers, metal boxes of varying sizes, some of them sealed with the kind of rubber gasket that her father had used on everything he wanted to protect from moisture, some of them plain boxes that were less intact but still present. There was a wooden chest with an iron hasp, newer looking than the shelves, which meant her father had brought it in after the chamber was built. There were rolled documents in a cylindrical tin case. There was a ledger on the shelf nearest to the steps, with a piece of oilcloth wrapped around it and tied with twine. Hannah's light moved over the large mechanical object under the canvas. "Mrs. Carter," Hannah said, in a voice she was keeping carefully level, "is that a turbine?" "A hydroelectric turbine," Eleanor said. "Small scale. My father designed it himself, using published research and engineering texts. He spent most of the late 60s adapting the design to the mill's water flow." She paused. "He told me once that water moving at the right speed through the right channel could generate enough electricity to run a modest operation. He said the big utilities had convinced everyone that electricity had to come from somewhere enormous and far away. But that wasn't true. It had only to come from water falling where it fell." Hannah walked slowly around the turbine. She lifted the canvas at one corner, carefully. In the light of her phone, the copper fittings gleamed dully, unchanged by the years in a way that the iron would not have been. Her father had chosen copper throughout, Eleanor now saw, with the foresight of a man who had thought about what would last. "The coupling to the water channel," Hannah said. "The pipe runs through the wall here." She traced it with the beam of her light, which connects to the old drainage culvert. She stood very still for a moment. "This could still be functional," she said. "I'd have to assess the channel for blockages, and the sluice gate mechanism is going to be frozen, and there may be—" She stopped. "Mrs. Carter, this is a real installation. This is—" She was not able to finish the sentence. "My father," Eleanor said, "was a serious man." She walked to the shelves. She picked up the ledger in its oilcloth. She untied the twine carefully, feeling the knot give after some resistance, and she opened the oilcloth, and she opened the ledger. The handwriting on the first page was her grandmother's. Ruth Mae Carter had died in 1989, and she had been 91 years old when she died. And her handwriting had been clear and slightly angular until her last years, distinctive, unmistakable, the handwriting of a woman who had learned to write in an era when children were drilled in penmanship, and it showed. Eleanor had not seen it in 36 years. She stood in a stone chamber under her father's abandoned mill, with her grandmother's handwriting open in front of her. And she did not cry. She pressed her lips together once, and she breathed through her nose, and she read the first line on the first page. If you have found this, Eleanor, then it is your time. Not before. Not someone else's. Yours. She read the line twice. The third time she read it, she understood that her grandmother had known, somehow, that the ledger might be found by a stranger, by Daniel, by someone who had no right to it. And Ruth had addressed it to Eleanor by name, because Ruth had believed, had known, with the kind of certainty that belonged to people who had spent their whole lives watching families fail and survive, that Eleanor was the only one who would understand what it meant to arrive here with a key that had been carried for 50 years without being used. Hannah was watching from across the chamber. She did not speak. Daniel was still above them, at the top of the stairs. Eleanor could hear him pacing. She turned the first page. The ledger's early entries were in Ruth's hand. Grain records from the early 1960s, customer names, quantities, the small marks Ruth made in the margins to indicate payment, partial payment, goods exchanged in lieu. Eleanor recognized some of the names: the Ingrams, the Lester family, the Owens brothers, who had farmed the high ground above the West Ridge for 3 generations before the last of them sold in the late 70s. These were not accounts in the financial sense. They were a record of a community's daily life, written in flour and cornmeal and bushels of wheat. A few pages in, the handwriting changed. Samuel's hand was rounder and more deliberate than his mother's, with a slight pressure on the downstrokes that his mother did not have. He had taken over the ledger sometime around 1970. Eleanor could tell from the dates on the entries, and where Ruth's entries had been purely transactional, Samuel's began to include notes, observations about the grinding weather conditions, the quality of the grain in a particular season, small mechanical observations about the mill's performance. Then, gradually, something different. Notes on water flow, on head pressure, on the relationship between the volume of water moving through the old channel and the theoretical capacity to generate a modest electrical current. He had been working it out on the page, doing the mathematics in the margins, revising. Several pages were dense with calculations that Eleanor could not fully follow, but she didn't need to follow them. She understood what they were. Hannah, who came over quietly and looked over Eleanor's shoulder, did follow them, and the sound she made was quiet but unmistakable. He calculated the head, Hannah said, the fall height from the intake to the wheel chamber, and he estimated the flow rate using, these are creek gauge observations. He was taking measurements. She pointed to a column of numbers with dates beside them, spanning several years in the early 1970s. He did this over years to get the seasonal variance. He was patient, Eleanor said. He did everything slowly. This design is conservative, Hannah said. He wasn't trying to run a power grid. He was trying to generate enough to run the mill's lights and a few small motors, maybe 15 to 20 kilowatts, under good conditions. She paused. That's not nothing, but it's not a fortune either. No, Eleanor said. It's not. It was exactly the right size. It was exactly the size of a thing designed to keep one property running, not to make anyone rich. That was Samuel. He had never been interested in being rich. He had been interested in things working. He had been interested in self-sufficiency, in the idea that you could take responsibility for your own ground and not owe the world anything you hadn't earned. Eleanor turned more pages. Near the back of the ledger, the entries stopped being about grain or water. The last 15 pages were a different kind of document. They were instructions. Ruth had written some of it, and Samuel had written some of it, and they had clearly collaborated on it, because in places the handwriting shifted mid-paragraph, Ruth finishing a thought that Samuel had begun, Samuel clarifying something Ruth had written with a note in the margin. Eleanor had never seen her father and grandmother write together before. She had not known they had. The collaborative quality of it, the two of them working out the words together, on paper, across what must have been several sessions, moved her in a way that was separate from everything else she felt in that moment. The instructions were addressed to her by name throughout. They assumed she would know what the mill was. They assumed she would understand the technical aspects of the turbine. They assumed she would have the capacity to decide what to do with the property. They did not assume she would be young. There was a line near the end in Samuel's hand that read, "The property has been placed in a family preservation instrument filed in Floyd County. The document is recorded. Ask for the Preservation Trust, filed under the Carter Family Land Holdings, 1973. It protects the mill, the cottage, the water rights, and the land described in the attached survey. The trust names you as successor steward upon our deaths. Eleanor Mae Carter, you specifically. No one else can direct this land." Eleanor read the line 3 times. Then she looked up at the stairs where Daniel was standing at the top, looking down at her with an expression she had not seen on his face since he was 8 years old and had broken something he wasn't supposed to touch. "There's something I need to look at in those metal boxes," she said to Hannah, quietly. "But first I need to make a second phone call." She climbed the stairs with Hannah steadying her, and when she reached the top, she stood for a moment in the open mill and breathed the wet stone air and felt the mist on her face. And then she looked at her son. "Sit down," she said. "Mama, there's a piece of the millstone housing behind you. It's solid. Sit on it." He sat. Eleanor stood in front of him. She did not raise her voice. She had never been a woman who raised her voice. She had always believed that a quiet voice in a serious conversation was more effective than a loud one, because it required the listener to pay attention. "I am going to tell you what I know," she said, "and then I am going to tell you what I am going to do. And I am going to ask you to answer one question, and I need you to tell me the truth." Daniel looked at his hands. "The house," Eleanor said. "James's house. My house." "You moved it into your LLC." He didn't answer. "The documents I signed," she said. "The ones you said were for tax purposes. Some of them were not for tax purposes." Silence. "You used the house as security for business debt," she said, "and the creditors came, and the house is gone. That is why you arranged the facility. That is why this happened this morning. Not because you were worried about me living alone, because there was no longer anything for me to live in, and you needed to put me somewhere and move on." Daniel's jaw tightened. He raised his eyes. For a moment, she thought he was going to deny it, to begin one of the careful, redirected explanations she had been hearing from him for months, but he didn't. "I was going to fix it," he said. I thought I was going to be able to fix it before it got this far. But you didn't. No. And you did not ask me. You did not tell me. You did not treat me as a person whose opinion and permission were necessary. Mama, I was trying to protect you from... You were protecting yourself, Eleanor said, from having to tell me the truth, from having to sit in this room or any room and look at your mother and say, I have made serious mistakes and I need help. She paused. There is a difference between those two things. I need you to know that I understand the difference. He didn't say anything. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had finally set it down and could not yet tell whether the relief was going to be larger or smaller than the shame. Here is my question, Eleanor said, and I need the truth, not a careful version. The truth. Did Melissa know? He was quiet for a long moment. She knew some of it, he said. Not all of it. At first I told her it was temporary, that the accounts were just... He stopped. She knew enough, he said finally. She didn't want to know more. Eleanor nodded once. All right, she said. Here is what is going to happen. She told him about the chamber. She told him about the ledger. She told him what Samuel had written about the Preservation Trust. She watched his face as she told him, and she watched what happened there, the rapid movement behind his eyes as he calculated what this meant, whether it changed his position, whether it was usable in some way. She watched the calculation move through him, and she watched it reach its conclusion, which was that a family preservation trust filed in 1973 and naming Eleanor as successor steward was not subject to his LLC's debts. The mill was not his. It had never been his. It had been hers in trust since her father died. What she had seen him do this morning, arranging her belongings, labeling her boxes, sending a van for her things, he had done believing he had taken everything. He had inventoried her life and found it manageable. He had counted her possessions like an accountant counts assets, and he had arranged the remainder in a facility with a garden, and he had believed he had accounted for everything. He had not accounted for what she still held inside her head. He had not accounted for the brass key, or the water moving below the mill, or the ledger in her grandmother's handwriting, or the county record filed 50 years ago in a building 15 miles away that named Eleanor Mae Carter as the person this land was for. He had not accounted for her. The house is gone, she said. I understand that. I am not going to fight for it, because fighting for it would cost more than it would recover, and I am 81 years old, and I do not have that time. She watched him. But I am not going to a facility. I'm going to call an attorney, my attorney, not yours, and I am going to have someone pull the county records and confirm the Preservation Trust, and I am going to stay here on this property, in the mill keeper's cottage, while that work is done. Daniel looked at the mill around him. She could see him seeing it for the first time, as something other than a ruin, something with legal weight, with history, with documents behind it. He opened his mouth to say something. Don't, Eleanor said. Not right now. Right now, I need you to go sit in your truck and let me and Hannah do the work that needs doing. He went. Before we go further, what do you think Eleanor is about to find in those sealed metal boxes? Leave your answer in the comments. We'll be right back. The metal boxes took the rest of the morning, Hannah brought them up from the chamber one at a time, carrying them carefully, despite the fact that they were heavier than they looked, because the rubber gaskets Samuel had used to seal them had turned rigid over the decades and required steady pressure to release without breaking. Eleanor sat on a low section of the old stone wall outside the mill in the thin autumn sunshine that had appeared when the mist burned off, and she went through each container as Hannah brought it. The first held maintenance records for the turbine, handwritten pages of technical notes in Samuel's hand, interspersed with diagrams, measurements, small sketches of components he had fabricated himself in the shop behind the house. Hannah set these aside with the focused expression of someone encountering a primary source they had not expected to find in the world. The second held grain ledgers, older ones, predating Ruth's ledger in the chamber, records from the 1940s and 1930s, the handwriting of Eleanor's grandfather, Henry, who had built the mill in its current form after the old one burned in 1929. These were not legal documents. They were history, a record of a community's sustenance, bushel by bushel, season by season, written by a man Eleanor had never met but felt she knew from the shape of his transactions, generous with credit, precise with quantities, fond of noting in the margin when a particular customer's corn had been especially good. The third box held what she had been waiting for, 3 sealed document packets wrapped in oilcloth within the metal box, each tied with the same twine Samuel had used throughout, and on the outside of each packet, in his handwriting, a label. The first label read, Mill Property, Survey and Deed. The second read, Water Rights, Original Grant and Current. The third read, Carter Family Preservation Trust, Executed Copy, Floyd County, 1973. Eleanor held the third packet for a moment without opening it. The sun was on her hands. The creek was running loud and clear below the mill, up from the rain, throwing a faint mist into the air where it moved fast over the rocks. In the trees above the mill, a pair of ravens had been moving around since morning. She had heard them, that particular hollow knocking call, like someone striking wood, and she heard them now, back in the maples. She thought about Ruth, who had spent 50 years grinding corn and wheat for people who were gone now, most of them, who had kept her accounts in careful columns and her records in oilcloth, and her knowledge in the hands and memory of one specific granddaughter, who had written the first line in that ledger, knowing that someday Eleanor would come down those stone steps and find it, and who had chosen very precisely what those first words would be. If you have found this, Eleanor, then it is your time. Ruth had not said if someone has found this. She had said if you have. She had known, or she had believed, which for Ruth was close enough to the same thing. Eleanor untied the twine on the third packet and opened the oilcloth. Inside was a typewritten document of 11 pages, the paper slightly yellowed but sound, and on the cover page, in the formal language of a legal instrument executed in Floyd County, Virginia, in the year 1973, were the names Samuel Elias Carter as truster, Ruth Mae Carter as co-truster, and Eleanor Mae Carter named expressly as successor trustee and lifetime steward upon the deaths of both trusters. The document described the property in precise metes and bounds. The mill keeper's cottage, which stood 200 yards north of the mill along the creek bank, which Eleanor had not yet gone to see and was not yet ready to see. The water rights to the creek channel, granted to the Carter family in an instrument from 1891. 14 acres of surrounding land, described in the survey, whose original was in the first packet, and the purpose of the trust, stated clearly on page 3, to preserve and maintain the mill property for the educational, historical, and community benefit of Floyd County and the broader Appalachian region, to support the continuation of traditional grain milling practices, to protect the property from sale, commercial development, or private exploitation, and to ensure that the knowledge of water-powered milling, its history, its practice, and its connection to the food systems of the region shall be available to future generations. The trust could not be dissolved by Eleanor's heirs. It could not be transferred to a private business entity. It could not be used as security for personal debt. It was protected in a way that Samuel, who had known his community and his era and the direction things were moving, had designed specifically to survive the kind of pressure that Daniel had applied. Samuel had not known about Daniel. He had known about the world. Eleanor held the document in her lap for a moment. On the stone wall in the October sun, with the creek below and the ravens above, and the old mill behind her, with its one broken corner and its sound of water. And she let herself feel the full weight of what her father had built down here, in secret, in the early morning hours before the heat came, while he sent her on errands so she wouldn't see the last steps. He had not hidden it from her out of distrust. He had hidden it from her so she would find it herself, so it would be a discovery and not an instruction, so she would come to it under her own power, at her own time, because of her own knowledge, and it would be unquestionably hers. She had been carrying the key for 50 years, and she had not known exactly what it opened. She had known it was the mill key, the key to the padlock on the main door, long since rusted beyond use, but it was also this moment, this afternoon on the stone wall, her grandmother's voice on the page. Hannah came and sat beside her. She did not speak. She looked at the document in Eleanor's hands, and she read what she could read from where she sat, and then she looked at the creek. After a while, Eleanor said, "I need to find out if this was recorded." "County Courthouse," Hannah said. "The Land Records Office. They keep instruments going back to 1863, Eleanor said. "I know. I need someone to go there and pull it." "I can go this afternoon," Hannah said. "Or we can call. Most county records offices have a phone line for—" "I want a physical copy," Eleanor said. "I want someone to go there and hold it in their hands and tell me it's there." "I'll go," Hannah said. "I'll leave in an hour. Is there anything else you need?" Eleanor looked at the mill, at the broken corner where the rain came in, at the stone walls that had stood for a century, at the door opening, gaping and dark, waiting. "Yes," she said. "I need to see the cottage." The mill keeper's cottage was 200 yards north, along a path that had once been clear and was now overgrown with blackberry cane and mountain laurel, so that walking it required picking your way carefully, holding branches aside, watching for the thorns. Eleanor knew where the path was, because she had walked it so many times that her feet remembered even when her eyes could barely see the way through the growth. It was not a large structure it had never been. It was a single-story stone building, 2 rooms when Eleanor was a child, and later expanded by her grandfather to 3. The main room with the fireplace, the kitchen, the sleeping room added on the back. The roof was tin, and the tin had held better than the mill's wooden shingles. And the walls were the same fieldstone construction. And when Eleanor pushed open the door, it was not locked. The old wooden door had swelled in its frame, but opened when she leaned into it. The inside was dark and close, and smelled of mouse and damp and the particular dusty sweetness of a closed space that had once been a home. The fireplace was intact. The stone hearth was sound, though dirty. The windows were intact on the west wall, broken on the east, 2 panes gone, the frames themselves still solid. There was a rusted wood stove in the kitchen. There were shelves still attached to the walls, empty, a little warped. There was a plank floor that flexed underfoot in 2 places, but was otherwise sound. Eleanor stood in the center of the main room and breathed. The room was not habitable as it stood. It would need work, cleaning, repair, weathering addressed, the windows fixed, the chimney inspected, probably a new section of flashing on the roof where the east addition joined the original building. But it was stone, and stone had endured here, and the work was not impossible. She was 81 years old. She had a bad hip. She was not going to do the work herself. But she had assets she had not possessed this morning. She had a young engineer with a passion for historic infrastructure and a working knowledge of small water systems. She had a preservation trust that protected this land from Daniel's creditors. She had a county record that, if Hannah confirmed it this afternoon, established her legal right to be here. She had been turned out of a house. She had found, in its place, a property that had always been hers, preserved in trust by 2 people who had known her better than she had known herself at 30. She was not sentimental about the cottage. She was practical about it. She could live here if the repairs were made. It was not the house where she and James had raised their children, but James was gone, and the children were mostly grown and mostly scattered. And the house was gone too, in its way, transferred into an LLC with business debts against it. This was different. This was hers in a way that could not be undone. She found a piece of old mortar on the hearth, and she sat down on the hearthstone. It was cold and gritty against the back of her legs, but solid, utterly solid. And she sat there for a while in the dark room with the October light coming through the intact windows on the west, and she thought about what came next. What came next required the attorney first. Eleanor had maintained a relationship with a Floyd County attorney named Robert Acuff for 30 years. He was older now, semi-retired, and his practice was handled mostly by his daughter, who had taken over the name of the firm, but not yet the building. Eleanor had not called the Acuff office in 4 years, and she was aware that things might have changed further. But she called the number she had in her phone, and a woman who answered sounded like she knew who Eleanor was, and Eleanor explained in 3 careful sentences what she needed. I need the Carter Family Preservation Trust, pulled from Floyd County land records. It was filed in 1973. I'm holding what appears to be an executed copy. A pause. I also need someone to review the documents that were signed in my name over the last several months relating to my former residence and financial accounts. I believe some of them may have been signed under misrepresentation. The woman on the other end of the phone, whose name was Catherine Acuff, and who was 42 years old and had inherited both her father's practice and his habit of listening more than he spoke, said, "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" "I can come in today," Eleanor said, "at 3 o'clock. "I'll make it work," Catherine Acuff said. Eleanor put her phone away. She was sitting on the hearthstone in the mill keeper's cottage, and she had just set in motion something that would take months to resolve and would require patience. She had in abundance and energy. She was going to have to budget carefully. She was aware of the hip, the stiffness in her hands, the way the cold of the stone was working through her slacks. She was aware that she was 81 years old and had been awake since 3 in the morning and had not eaten the biscuit in her pocket. She ate it now. She ate it on the hearthstone, unwrapping the wax paper carefully, spreading a little apple butter from the small container Daniel had included. She had almost left it, but she had not left it, because she was not going to waste good food over a principle. And she ate the biscuit in small, careful bites, and she drank the last of the water from a bottle Hannah had left with her, and she sat in the dark cottage that had belonged to generations of Carters. And she thought about her grandmother grinding corn in a different century. And she thought about her father working alone in the early mornings on a machine he intended for a future he might not live to see. She thought about the water still moving in the channel below the mill, moving through the long sealed years, moving through the storms and the ice and the seasons when the building above it was silent, not waiting for anything, not stopped by anything, just moving, because that was what water did. It found the available path and it moved, and you could block it in places and slow it down and divert it and dam it up, but eventually, always, it found its way through. She had been like that, she thought. Not in the dramatic sense. She was not going to compare herself to a river in any sort of heroic way. But she had kept moving in the available path. She had kept her ledgers when James was sick. She had kept her accounts when the boys were small and money was tight, and she'd worked 2 jobs for a period, teaching elementary school and helping out at the extension office on weekends. She had kept her records and her memory and her knowledge of grain and gears and water because they were hers and because she was the kind of person who kept things that were hers. Daniel had believed she could see this now, could trace the logic of it, that she was a person defined by her possessions, that when her possessions were transferred, the person would be transferable too, that you could move Eleanor Mae Carter the way you moved a piece of furniture, label the boxes, put her somewhere smaller, explain to her what she was allowed to keep. He had confused her with her things. She had spent a long time making that confusion possible by holding herself too close to him, by accepting explanations that she knew were not complete, by protecting him from the consequences of minor dishonesty long enough that the minor dishonesty had grown into something she could no longer protect either of them from. Ruth had taught her about that too, in a way. Not in so many words, but in the lesson she had repeated so many times that It had become part of Eleanor's understanding of how things worked. When the grinding goes uneven, the inexperienced miller forces the stones together. The experienced miller slows everything down and finds what has shifted. Forcing stones together when something has gone wrong does not fix the problem. It destroys the grain and breaks the equipment both, and leaves you with damage that might have been avoided if you'd been willing to stop and find the real trouble before it got worse. She had been trying to hold her family together by force for a long time. She was done with that. Hannah returned at 5:30. She came down the path to the cottage with a printed page in her hand. She had photographed the county record on her phone and printed it at the courthouse, which had a public printer in the lobby for exactly this purpose. And her face was doing the thing it did when she had found something important and was trying to be a professional about it. "It's there," she said. She was slightly out of breath. Carter Family Mill and Land Preservation Trust. Recorded Floyd County, September the 8th, 1973. Instrument number. She looked at the page. "I won't read the whole number, but it's there, fully indexed. The property description matches the survey in the box. The trust structure is intact. The successor trustee designation is clear." She handed Eleanor the printout. Eleanor looked at it. The language was formal and old-fashioned in the way that legal instruments from 50 years ago were, full of whereases and heretofores, but the substance of it was unmistakable. This property, these 14 acres, this mill and cottage and water rights, belonged to a preservation trust whose purposes were educational and communal, and whose steward was Eleanor Mae Carter. "The trust was indexed under land records," Hannah said, "which is why it might not have shown up in a standard property search. It's not a deed. It's an instrument of trust. You'd have to know to look for it." "Daniel didn't know to look," Eleanor said. "No. He assumed the mill was worthless. He assumed there was nothing there worth recording." "Yes," Hannah said. "He assumed I didn't know anything he hadn't told me." She said this without bitterness. It was simply an observation about the limits of her son's imagination. He had seen her as a person defined by what she no longer had, and he had not considered that there are things a person carries that do not appear on any inventory. Eleanor folded the printout and put it inside the oilcloth with the trust document. The light outside was going. The Blue Ridge went dark early in October, the sun dropping behind the western ridge, while the sky was still light above, and the hollow where the mill stood was already in shadow, though there was blue sky visible between the tops of the maples. The temperature was dropping. Eleanor was cold. The hearthstone had taken the warmth from her bones, and she needed to stand up and move and get somewhere with heat before her hip locked entirely. "Is there anywhere you can stay tonight?" Hannah asked carefully. "Not the facility," Eleanor said. "No," Hannah said. "I didn't mean that. I have a spare room." Eleanor considered this. She was not a person who accepted help easily. She was stubborn, as she knew, and she had a particular brand of independence that had served her well for most of her life and had, on occasion, made things harder than they needed to be. But she was also practical, and practical people understood when the moment called for accepting what was offered. "One night," she said, Until the attorney's meeting. One night, Hannah agreed, or however long it takes. Eleanor stood up from the hearthstone, slowly, with one hand on the cold stone of the fireplace for balance, and she straightened up and she looked around the cottage one more time. In the thin last light, it was not only neglected, it was structured. The bones of it were sound. She could see, the way she could always see in a thing that was old and damaged, but not beyond saving, what it had once been and what it might become again. The chimney will need to be cleaned before winter, she said, noting it for herself, and the east windows replaced. That plank floor in the kitchen will need sistering. There's rot in 2 joists. I could feel it when I walked across. The tin roof needs inspection, but I think it's sound. She paused. The wood stove may be salvageable. Hannah was writing it down in her notebook. Of course she was. I'll want an engineer's eye on the structural stuff, Eleanor said. The stone itself is fine. Stone like that. She gestured at the wall. Stone like that doesn't rot. You just have to clear away what's grown over it. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. My grandmother lived in this cottage for 15 years, she said. After my grandfather died, she lived here alone, and she ground corn and kept her ledgers, and she walked to the mill every morning, and she kept the water running through the channel, and she knew what the wheels sounded like on a good day, and she knew what it sounded like on a bad one. She paused. She lived here until she was 91 years old, and she was grinding corn until she was 88. That's something, Hannah said. It is, Eleanor said, and she walked out into the October evening. The meeting with Catherine Acuff lasted 3 hours. Eleanor brought the oilcloth with the trust documents, the survey, the water rights records, the ledger from the chamber, and the photocopy Hannah had made of Samuel's technical notes on the turbine. She also brought from memory a precise and chronological account of every document Daniel had asked her to sign in the previous 8 months, every change to her financial accounts, every conversation she could recall about her estate, and the names and approximate dates of every instance in which he had intercepted her mail or redirected her communications. Catherine Acuff listened to all of it without interrupting, taking notes in the way her father had always taken notes, precise, minimal, organized, with the particular quality of attention that distinguishes a good attorney from an adequate one. She looked at the trust document. She looked at the county record printout. She looked at the survey. She made 2 phone calls to colleagues, brief ones, to confirm 2 specific points of Virginia property law. At the end of 3 hours, Catherine Acuff said, "The Preservation Trust is valid. I need to review the full language carefully and consult with a property law specialist. But on the basis of what I'm seeing, the instrument was properly recorded, properly structured, and cannot be dissolved by your son or encumbered by his business debts. The mill property is not subject to any claim from Daniel's creditors." "And my former house," Eleanor said. Catherine was quiet for a moment. "That's more complicated. The transfers you signed over the past several months, if they were obtained by misrepresentation, there may be grounds for claims. But recovering the house itself would be difficult and expensive, particularly if the LLC's creditors have already moved against it." She met Eleanor's eyes. "I want to be honest with you. The house is probably gone. What we can do is protect you from any further liability connected to Daniel's company, establish your rights under the trust, and pursue compensation for what was taken if we can substantiate the misrepresentation. Eleanor nodded. She had not expected a different answer. She had not come to Catherine Acuff expecting a miracle. She had come expecting truth, which was what she had been unable to get from her own son. The financial accounts, Eleanor said. The ones Daniel moved to online management. Can I regain control? Yes, Catherine said. That process is straightforward. We'll start that immediately. And the documents I signed, the power of attorney, the LLC transfer, will challenge them on the grounds of misrepresentation. I can't promise the outcome, but there's a case. Eleanor thought about this. She thought about Daniel's children, who were 16 and 13, who had not done anything wrong and who were going to grow up in the shadow of their father's choices. She thought about Melissa, who had known enough and had chosen to know only enough, which was its own kind of failure. She thought about Daniel himself, sitting in his truck this morning, looking at his hands. She had spent 50 years loving her son imperfectly, too much in some directions, not enough in others, confusing her own desire for things to be all right with the reality that they were not. She had looked away when she should have looked directly. She had accepted explanations when she should have asked harder questions. She had protected him from small consequences long enough that the large consequences had arrived anyway, only now they were not manageable. She was not going to protect him from these. I will cooperate fully with any legal process, Eleanor said. I will not make false statements to protect him. I will not minimize what happened, and I will not pursue him beyond what the law and the evidence support. She paused. But I will not protect him. Catherine Acuff nodded. That's the right position. Eleanor put on her coat. She took the oilcloth and its contents, and wrapped it carefully, and put it in her bag. And she stood up, and she reached into her coat pocket, and she felt the key, the brass mill key, cold and present. One more thing, she said. I'll need you to send Daniel a letter explaining the existence and status of the Preservation Trust, certified mail, to his office and his home address. She thought for a moment. And I'd like it to include the language from the trust document naming me as successor steward. I want him to see it in writing. I want him to understand what it means. Catherine Acuff wrote this down. He's going to be angry, she said, not as a warning, as an observation. He might be, Eleanor said, or he might be relieved. Those two things are not as different as people think when a secret has been kept too long. She walked out of the law office into the evening, into the cool mountain air that smelled of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, and she put her face up to the sky for a moment and breathed. And then she got into Hannah's truck, and they drove back to Floyd. The weeks that followed were not easy, and were not simple, and Eleanor did not expect them to be. She stayed in Hannah's spare room for 8 days, which was longer than one night and shorter than the situation required, and then Hannah's landlord had an objection about long-term guests, and an old friend named Vera Sutton, the widow of James's former business partner, a woman Eleanor had known for 45 years, offered her the downstairs bedroom in the Sutton house on the south side of Floyd, and Eleanor moved there with her 2 bags and her oilcloth and her brass key, and the methodical acceptance of a woman who had decided that pride about small things was a luxury she did not have time for. She spent those first weeks doing 3 things. She spent mornings on the phone with Catherine Acuff's office, working through the financial documents, the account transfers, the power of attorney language, the recorded LLC transfer. The picture that emerged was not entirely surprising, but seeing it laid out in legal terms, piece by piece, had a quality of clarification that was also a quality of pain. Daniel had been careful. He had not acted in a single dramatic moment. He had moved slowly, incrementally, over 8 months, taking 1 degree of control at a time, the way you might turn up heat so gradually that the person in the room does not notice, until the room is very warm. Each individual action had seemed small. Together, they added up to a complete transfer of authority over every financial decision in Eleanor's life. This, Catherine told her, was a pattern the law recognized. It had a name. It left a traceable record. It was possible to challenge. Eleanor spent afternoons at the mill. Hannah drove her out every day, and sometimes Hannah stayed, and sometimes she went and came back. But Eleanor was there every afternoon for the better part of 3 weeks, sitting on the stone wall when the weather allowed, inside the mill when it didn't, going through the contents of the metal boxes with the careful patience she gave to everything that mattered. She cataloged what was there. She made a list, handwritten, in a notebook she had bought at the hardware store in Floyd, of every document in the chamber, organized by type, by date, by subject. She transcribed Samuel's technical notes into the notebook in a cleaner hand. She made notes on the ledger entries, matching names to families she remembered, filling in context that no document could contain. She was preparing. She was not yet sure what she was preparing for, specifically. But she knew the feeling, the same feeling she had when she ground corn, when she understood from the sound and the rhythm and the texture what the grain needed before it needed it, of a thing coming together. On the 4th week, Hannah came back from a meeting at Virginia Tech with a researcher named Dr. James Okafor, who was working on a grant proposal related to small-scale historic hydroelectric systems and their potential restoration as models for sustainable community energy. She came back with the look she got when she was trying not to be too excited about something. "He wants to come see the turbine," she said. "When?" Eleanor said. "Tomorrow, if you'll have him." "Tell him to bring boots," Eleanor said, the tracks still soft. Dr. Okafor came the next morning, a compact and careful man of about 50, with soil on his boots before he even got out of the truck because he had apparently driven through something on the way. And he went down into the chamber, and he spent 2 hours with the turbine and Samuel's drawings, and came back up looking like Hannah had looked at the county courthouse. "The design is conservative and well engineered," he said, standing in the mill with Eleanor and Hannah, while rain moved over the mountain outside. "The copper fittings are in remarkable condition. The water channel below needs to be cleared. There's significant sediment accumulation, and the inlet screen is almost certainly blocked, but the channel itself appears sound. If the sluice mechanism can be freed and the channel cleared, we may be looking at a functional system with modest modifications. He paused. The output, realistically, is going to be limited. Enough to run lights, basic tools, a small refrigeration unit, if you're careful. Not enough for commercial heating. Not enough to sell back to the grid in any meaningful quantity. I know, Eleanor said. The restoration would cost more than the turbine will ever generate in revenue, he said. That's important to be clear about. The value is not financial. I know that too, Eleanor said. What is the value, in your view? He was asking genuinely, not rhetorically. Eleanor thought about this. She looked at the millstone housing, the old iron spindle, the rusted fittings that her father and his father before him had maintained with the patient attention of people who understood that machinery was not a convenience, but a responsibility. My father spent years, she said, designing a system that would allow this mill to run independently of the power grid, not because he was opposed to electricity or progress or any of that, because he believed that the ability to do a thing yourself, to understand the mechanism and maintain it and make it work, that was different in kind from buying the output of someone else's mechanism and depending on it. She paused. He wanted this mill to be able to teach people that, to be able to show people what it looks like when you understand your tools well enough to make your own power. Dr. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a compelling educational framework." "My grandmother would have said it's just common sense," Eleanor said. He smiled. "Would you be open to a formal conversation about the possibility of a research and restoration partnership between the property trust and the university?" "I'm open to it," Eleanor said, "on conditions I would need to discuss with my attorney." He nodded. "Of course." "And the community," Eleanor said. "Whatever happens here will need to involve the local community, the farmers, the schools, the people who have history with this property." She looked at him steadily. "This was never meant to be a university project. My father's document makes that clear. It's a community trust. The university can be a partner if it understands what partnership means in that context." "I do understand," he said, and he sounded as though he did. Catherine Acuff called on a Thursday morning in November, 6 weeks after the first meeting. "The county records confirm everything," she said. "The trust is valid, the property is protected, and I've had a specialist review the transfer documents regarding your former house. 2 of the documents you signed were obtained under misrepresentations that we believe are legally material. We have grounds for a civil action." Eleanor was sitting at Vera Sutton's kitchen table with her second cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad, on which she had been working on a draft of the Preservation Trust's restoration guidelines. She set her pen down. "What does that mean practically?" she said. "For Daniel. Practically, he is facing personal liability for financial harm caused to you through fraudulent misrepresentation. He could face civil penalties, depending on how the investigation proceeds, and I should tell you that the County Financial Crimes Unit has been made aware there may also be criminal exposure." Catherine paused. "Eleanor, I have to ask you directly. What outcome do you want here?" Eleanor had been thinking about this for 6 weeks. She had thought about it in the early mornings at Vera's house, lying awake the way she had lain awake in her own house while the boxes accumulated in the front room. She had thought about Daniel at 9 years old, in the photograph that had hung on the wall, laughing at something out of frame. She had thought about the 16-year-old and the 13-year-old who were going to grow up carrying whatever their father did. She had thought about Melissa, who had known enough and not enough, who had been trying to protect her own children in the only way she could see, and who had chosen a way that was wrong. She had thought about Ruth, who had written that the lesson of the mill was not to force things together, who had said that the miller's first job, when something went wrong, was to find what had shifted, not to punish the grain for being difficult, not to destroy the machinery in frustration, but to understand the cause before addressing the effect. She had thought about Samuel, who had built a hidden chamber and filled it with records and documents and a small turbine designed to run a modest operation, and who had left it all for her, not to make her rich, but to make her free. "I want him to be accountable," Eleanor said. "I want the law to do what the law does, and I will cooperate with it fully. I will not make statements that minimize what happened. I will not ask investigators to look away from anything." She paused. "But I want his children protected from his debts. Whatever settlements occur, whatever penalties are assessed, the children should not carry that. We can advocate for that. And I want him to understand, not just legally, but personally, that he cannot contact me to apologize unless I ask for it. I am not available for his remorse on his timeline. He'll have to earn the conversation." "That's a clear boundary," Catherine said. "It took me a long time to learn how to have one," Eleanor said. "I'm not going to waste it." Daniel came to the mill on a morning in late November. He came without being invited and without calling, which was consistent with his character, and he arrived in his truck at the top of the track and walked down through the mud on a morning when Eleanor happened to be there with Hannah, who was assessing the sluice gate mechanism for the restoration plan. Eleanor saw him coming through the screen of mountain laurel. She had been expecting it, not on this specific morning, but on some morning. She had a sense of him the way you have a sense of weather in the mountains. You can't know the exact hour, but you can read what's building. She was standing at the creek bank. She waited. He stopped 10 feet from her. He looked older than he had in October. Not dramatically older, not broken. He was not a man given to visible falling apart, but something in his posture had changed. The particular quality of self-assurance that he had always carried, that slightly forward-tilted readiness to explain and manage and arrange, was not there in the same form. He looked like a man who had been arguing with himself for several weeks and was not sure he had won. "Mama," he said. "Daniel," she said. He looked at the mill. He looked at Hannah, who had turned from the sluice gate and was watching them, with the quietly attentive expression she used when she was making herself professionally invisible while remaining present. Then he looked at Eleanor. "The attorney's letter came," he said. "I know." "The county investigators called." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. The creek ran loud between them and the mill. It had rained for 2 days, and the water was up again, the same rush and cold stone smell that had been here every time Eleanor came. The mill's old wheel was visible from where they stood, its wooden paddles black with years and green with moss, not turning. Not yet. I thought He stopped, started again. When I started managing the accounts, I genuinely believed I was helping. In the beginning. He met her eyes. I know that's not a sufficient explanation. No, Eleanor said. It's not. I got afraid, he said. The business was. He stopped again. I was ashamed of how bad it was. I kept thinking I could fix it without having to tell anyone, without having to ask, without having to. He seemed to be looking for a word and not finding it, without looking like I'd failed. You were afraid of my judgment, Eleanor said. He was quiet. And so you decided to make the problem mine instead, she said. Not cruelly, as a fact. You transferred the risk to the person you were afraid to tell the truth to. Because if you failed and I didn't know, it would feel like it hadn't happened yet. And if you could fix it before I knew, then you'd have succeeded after all. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face since he was much younger, and she understood it only now, at 81, in a way she hadn't when she was 50 or 60. It was the expression of a person who has been seen clearly, without flattery or cruelty, and does not know whether to feel relieved or exposed. The children, he said, they're going to. The children are not responsible for what you did, Eleanor said. I've told Catherine as much. I'm not interested in anything that falls on them. He closed his eyes for a moment. Melissa, he said. Melissa will answer for her own part of it, Eleanor said. That's between her and her conscience, and whatever the law requires. I don't have anything to say to Melissa right now. He nodded. He was not going to argue. She had not expected him to. I need to ask you something, Eleanor said, and I need you to think about it carefully before you answer, because I'm only going to ask it once. She waited until she had his full attention. Your grandmother, Ruth, she spent 50 years grinding corn for this community. She kept ledgers, she kept records, she kept the water running through that channel every morning for as long as she was able. She preserved everything that mattered in a chamber under the floor of this mill, and she wrote my name on the first page of the record because she knew what I was and what I could do. She looked at him steadily. Did you ever know her? Not her name. What she was. He was very still. I thought I did, he said. You didn't, Eleanor said. And you didn't know me either. You knew my address and my bank accounts and my signature on a form. But you did not know me. She paused. That is not an accusation. It is a fact that I am giving you so that you have it going forward. Because there will be a time, a long time from now, when I may be willing to have a different kind of conversation with you. And when that time comes, if it comes, I will need you to have thought about this. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, Yes, ma'am. It was the phrase she had heard from him as a small boy, when he meant something completely, when he was using the words his grandmother had taught him instead of anything he had invented himself. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the creek. You can go, she said. Catherine's office will be in touch. He went. Hannah, at the sluice gate, said nothing. She turned back to the mechanism, the rusted iron wheel, and she began working at it again with the wrench she'd been using when he arrived. Eleanor stood at the creek bank and listened to the water and let the sound of it work through her the way it always had, grounding, cold, constant. Winter came to the Blue Ridge the way it always did, not with drama, but with patience. A frost first, then several frosts, then a morning of snow that melted by afternoon. The maples lost their leaves in the first real wind, and the mountain laurel along the creek path turned its particular dull winter green, and the sky over the hollow was blue and thin and very high on clear days, and close and gray on the many days that were not clear. Eleanor moved into the cottage in December. It had taken 6 weeks of work to make it habitable. Catherine's office had identified a local contractor, a man named Roy Shiflett, whose grandfather had actually worked at the mill as a young man, which Eleanor had not known but found entirely appropriate, and he had done the structural repairs with the care of someone who understood what old stone buildings were and what they were worth. The east windows were replaced. The tin roof was inspected, and 2 sections of flashing replaced. The chimney was cleaned and recapped. The kitchen floor joists were sistered with new lumber. The wood stove was found to be operable after cleaning and a new stovepipe section. Eleanor had chosen the interior herself. She did not want a decorated cottage. She wanted a functional one. A good mattress, a kitchen table with 4 chairs, because she intended to have visitors. Shelves for her books and her records, and the notebooks she kept, and the ledgers that were now, in their own way, hers to continue. A reading lamp by the window that faced the creek, because the light on the water in the morning was the most beautiful thing she had seen in years, and she wanted to have it with her coffee. She moved in on a Saturday in December, with Hannah's help and Vera Sutton's help, and the quiet assistance of 2 young men from Roy Shiflett's crew who carried boxes without being asked what was in them. By evening she was in her chair by the window with a fire in the wood stove and a cup of black coffee and the creek outside in the dark. And she listened to the water, and she felt the specific quality of rightness that comes to a person who is, for perhaps the first time in a long time, exactly where they are supposed to be. Spring came with its usual audacity, crocuses in March, redbuds in April, the creek full and cold and loud with snowmelt, the mountain laurel blooming along the path in May, with that particular pink-white that always looked, to Eleanor, like something that had been waiting patiently through the cold and had decided that enough was enough. The sluice gate was freed in late February. It had taken Hannah and Dr. Okafor and a mechanical engineer from Roanoke 3 days of careful work to free the rusted mechanism without damaging it, clearing the channel by hand and with a small water pump, replacing a section of the wooden trough where the wood had rotted through, and installing a new screen at the intake point. On a Saturday morning in late February, with Eleanor standing on the creek bank and Hannah at the gate mechanism, they released the water. It moved through the channel the way water moves through any new path, not confidently at first, finding the edges, pushing the remaining sediment ahead of it, slowing where the channel narrowed, speeding where it opened. And then it found its rhythm, the old stone-lined rhythm that Samuel had known and Ruth had known and Eleanor's grandfather, Henry, had designed in the 1920s, and it moved with purpose toward the mill. The overshot wheel turned, not smoothly, not at full speed. The old wood was still swollen in places, and the iron fittings still rough with rust, and the first revolution was halting, a full quarter-minute of groaning protest before the second paddles came under the water, and the third, and the weight of the water found the mechanism, and the wheel began, slowly, steadily, turning. Eleanor heard the gears inside the mill respond. She heard the pit wheel engage. She heard the shaft begin to move. She heard the millstones, great, patient, unmoved by 50 years of silence, find each other again with a sound like two very old things recognizing each other. She stood in the February cold, with her breath coming out white, and her hands in her coat pockets, and her thumb on the brass key, and she listened to the mill come back to life. Hannah was crying, which she would have denied if asked. Dr. Okafor was writing something in his notebook very rapidly. Roy Shiflett, who had come to watch, took off his cap and held it in both hands. Eleanor said nothing. She listened. She had learned 60-some years ago to listen to the mill before she said anything about it. She listened to the rhythm. She listened for what was right and what was off and what needed attention. She heard the unevenness in one section of the wheel, a paddle, worn thinner than the others, giving slightly less resistance, creating a small hitch in the rotation. She heard the main shaft vibrating at a frequency slightly higher than ideal. She heard a grinding from one of the older iron fittings that would need to be addressed before anything was run through the millstones. And under all of it, beneath the creak and the turn, and the ancient protest of machinery awakening, she heard the water, still moving, moving now as it had moved in the sealed decades, moving the way it had moved when Ruth Mae Carter stood in this same valley and listened to it at 5 a.m. before the customers arrived, moving the way it had moved when Henry Carter built the wheel housing and fitted the stones and said, "Here is where we will do the work." Moving because it was water, and because the mountain was high, and because gravity was patient in the way that only the truly old and truly fundamental things are patient, waiting for the moment when someone clears the channel and opens the gate. "The paddle on the south face," Eleanor said to Hannah. "Fourth from the top. It's shallower than the others. Probably where damage from before the mill closed. Before we run any grain, that needs to be evened out." Hannah wrote it down. "And the iron coupling on the main shaft," Eleanor said. "Hear that? The pitch is too high. It needs lubrication and possibly a new bushing." Hannah wrote that down, too. Eleanor took the brass key out of her pocket. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling its weight, its small, cold certainty. It had not opened the mill padlock in decades. That lock was gone. The hasp rusted away, the door itself long since off its hinges. She had carried the key anyway, for 50 years, the way she carried her grandmother's voice, the way she carried every lesson she had ever been taught by someone who understood that teaching is an act of profound optimism about the future. She looked at the key. It had never been only a key to a door. She closed her fingers around it and put it back in her pocket. "All right," she said. "Let's find out what needs to be done." The legal proceedings took 14 months in total. The civil case established that 2 of the documents Eleanor had signed were obtained through material misrepresentation, specifically the document that had transferred authority over financial decisions and the document that had moved the residential property into Daniel's LLC. The court found for Eleanor on both. The compensation awarded was not large enough to replace what had been lost. The house itself remained in the LLC's estate, which was being liquidated to satisfy the construction company's creditors. But it was enough to establish Eleanor's costs, contribute to the cottage's renovation, and fund the first phase of the mill's preservation. The criminal investigation resulted in a charge of financial exploitation of an elderly person and one count of fraudulent misrepresentation. Daniel negotiated a plea arrangement. He did not serve prison time, but he was assessed a substantial fine, required to perform community service, and placed under a financial supervision order that restricted his business activities for 3 years. Melissa had known enough to be included in the civil proceedings, though not enough to be included in the criminal ones. The distinction was technical. Eleanor did not find it morally significant. She did not pursue Melissa beyond what was legally established. She did not contact her. She did not tell the grandchildren what to think about their parents. She sent the grandchildren, the 16-year-old and the 13-year-old, whose names were Cody and Anna, a card each at Christmas. The cards contained no message about what had happened. They contained a note from Eleanor saying that if they ever wanted to come to the mill, they were welcome, and that there would be things to learn there if they were interested in learning them. The 13-year-old Anna came in July with a school friend on a Saturday, and Eleanor spent 4 hours with her showing her how to read a grain ledger and how to tell by sound whether a wheel is running right. Anna was quiet and attentive, and at the end of the afternoon she asked Eleanor if she could come back. "Any time?" Eleanor said. She did not say this to begin a process of healing. She said it because it was true, and because the mill was a place for people to learn things, and because Anna was a person who was not responsible for her father's choices, and because Eleanor was not interested in extending the damage of one person's failures across generations when she had the option not to. The mill's educational program began in the autumn of the second year. It was not a dramatic launch. There were no ribbons cut, no dignitaries, no ceremony beyond a small gathering on a Saturday morning in October when the maples were turning, the same colors they had been turning when Daniel's truck had come down this road in the rain, and Eleanor had stood at the window of a house she no longer owned and felt the first full weight of what was happening. That had been 14 months ago. Now there were 7 people standing in the clearing beside the mill. Dr. Okafor was there, with 2 graduate students. Hannah was there, with the rolled survey maps she always seemed to carry. Roy Shiflett was there, and 2 women from the County Historical Preservation Office, and a man named Carl Hobbs, who taught high school agricultural science in Floyd, and had heard about the mill program from a colleague and had called Eleanor 3 times in the last month with questions. Eleanor stood in the door of the mill, and she looked at them. The wheel was turning. She had had it running since dawn. She liked to start it before anyone arrived, in the early morning when the hollow was quiet, and the only sounds were the water and the birds, because there was a quality to the mill in those early minutes that she wanted to exist before the day claimed it. The stones were turning. The shaft was moving. The smell of old grain dust, resurrected from the boards and the walls, and the 40 years the mill had held in silence moved through the open door in the thin October air. She had corn, a small bag, 30 pounds, from a farmer named Jesse Whitlock, who had been growing heirloom white corn on his family's land above the West Ridge for as long as Eleanor had known him. Jesse had heard about the mill from Roy, who had heard about it from Carl Hobbs, which was the way things happened in a county like Floyd, not through announcements but through the ordinary channels of people who knew each other, telling people who didn't what was happening and waiting to see who showed up. She had checked the corn that morning. She had taken a handful and held it up to the light from the east windows, running it through her fingers, the way Ruth had taught her, feeling for the give that told you the moisture content was right, smelling for the sweetness that told you the starches were intact, listening for the hollow sound of a kernel that had dried too fast. The corn was good. Jesse Whitlock's corn was always good. He was the kind of farmer who paid attention. "The stones are set at my grandmother's distance," Eleanor said to the people in the clearing, and they moved closer to hear her. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to in a quiet place if people were actually listening. Ruth Mae Carter ran this mill for 30 years, and she had her own sense of how the stones should sit, relative to each other. Not the specifications from the manufacturer. Those are a starting point. Her sense developed over time, from the sound of the grinding and the feel of the meal that came out and the quality of the cornbread made from it. She paused. "That's what I want to show you today, not the mechanism, the knowledge. The two are different things, and most people only teach the mechanism." Hannah was watching her with the expression she had used since the beginning, not adoring, not reverential, but attentive in the way that people are attentive when they are actually learning something, rather than performing the act of learning. "The first lesson," Eleanor said, "is to listen. You cannot know what this mill is doing correctly if you don't first know what it sounds like when it's doing everything right. So we're going to stand here for 5 minutes, and I'm going to tell you what you're hearing." No one objected. No one looked at their phone. 7 people stood in a clearing in the Blue Ridge on an October morning, and they listened to the mill. Eleanor listened with them. She heard the wheels steady and slightly uneven still. There was work yet to be done on the paddle depth. Jesse Whitlock's son was supposed to help with that in the spring. She heard the main shaft and its improved sound since Roy's crew had addressed the iron coupling with new bushings and a proper lubricant. She heard the millstones finding each other through the corn, the sound of grain becoming something smaller and more useful than it had been, the sound of transformation that was also the sound of a kind of practical grace. She heard the water in the channel below, moving under the floor, the way it had moved in the years of silence, the way it had moved when no one was listening, the way it had always been moving, patient as the mountain itself. She reached into her coat pocket. The brass key was there, where it always was, where it had been for 50 years. She held it. She thought about Ruth, who had given it to her on an ordinary afternoon when Eleanor was maybe 30, pressing it into her hand without ceremony and saying only, "Keep this, it's yours now." She thought about all the doors she had imagined it might open over the years, the mill door, which it no longer fit, the chamber below, which she had found without it in the end, the cottage, which had had no lock worth mentioning. She understood now fully what it had always opened. It opened the knowledge, not the building, the knowledge, the understanding of the water and the stone and the grain and the season and the sound of machinery working and the sound of machinery failing and the difference between the two. It was a key to the accumulated attention of two women, her grandmother and herself, paid over a lifetime to a particular place and a particular work, and to the discipline of noticing before acting, and to the faith that what you understood and what you preserved was available to the future even when the present could not use it. She had carried it for 50 years, and it had seemed to open nothing. It had been opening everything. She poured the corn into the hopper. She did it herself, standing on the small stool she had had Roy add beside the stone housing, because she was 81 years old and her reach was not what it had been. But she was going to pour the first corn through this mill herself, if it was the last thing she did. Hannah stood close enough to catch her if she needed it, and far enough away to make it clear she didn't expect to. The corn moved through the millstones. The sound changed, that deepening, fullening note that meant grain was meeting stone, that meant the mill was doing what it had always been here to do. The first meal came through the meal spout in a thin stream at first, then steadier, the white corn meal that was the color of old cream catching the October light. Eleanor watched it come out. She thought about the years it had taken to arrive at this morning. She thought about all the mornings that had looked nothing like this, the mornings in James's house, long before the trouble started, drinking coffee in a kitchen that smelled like home, the mornings teaching school, 27 years of them, standing at a board and trying to give something useful to people who were small enough that the whole world was still possible. The mornings sitting in the dark at 3 o'clock in those terrible weeks of boxes and folders, and her husband's chair disappearing from the room. She thought about the morning she had walked out of her own house in the rain with a brass key in her pocket and a cold biscuit and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, she was not finished. She had not been finished. A person does not become empty because others have stopped paying attention to them. The water keeps moving even when no one is listening. The knowledge is there even when no one is asking for it. The mill stands, patient as stone, waiting for someone to clear the channel and open the gate. Eleanor Mae Carter was 81 years old, and she was standing in her grandmother's mill on an October morning, and the stones were turning, and the water was running, and the corn was becoming cornmeal. And there were 7 people standing in a clearing waiting to learn from her. She turned from the hopper, and she looked at them. "Come inside," she said. "There's a lot to know. If you carry the name or memory of someone who built something quietly, taught something carefully, and kept working long after the world stopped watching, write their name below. They deserve to be remembered. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who would understand why. Like this video and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the people and the knowledge this world is still in danger of forgetting. And one last thing, the key. Eleanor still carries it. She carries it in the pocket of her dark blue cardigan, the one her husband gave her. Some mornings, when she walks from the cottage to the mill on the stone path that Roy Shiflet's crew cleared through the mountain laurel, she takes it out and holds it for a moment before she opens the day. It fits no lock on the property. There is no lock it fits, but she carries it anyway, the way you carry the things that have been true for long enough to become part of who you are. The mill turns, the water moves, the morning comes in off the mountain with the smell of cold stone and hickory and the faint mineral sweetness of the creek, and Eleanor Mae Carter sets her hand on the old wooden door frame, and she listens, the way Ruth taught her, the way all the real knowledge begins, before she says a word.